Finishing off this rust bucket restoration saga, today you'll see the sunny side of this 1973 Rhodes electric piano. First, we need to take off the action and key bed to expose the bare case. The black faux leather you see is called Tolex in our field, and it's usually glued on or stapled, and in this case, we'll be bringing it to a local upholsterer to get it redone. Getting it there was pretty easy as it was only a 10-minute drive, and it saved me about 8 to 12 hours of work and frustration.
Are you putting music over this?
With the action out, we figured it would be a good time to start whitening the keys, which in our process starts with a wet sand, 400, 600 to 800 grit, and then a buffing with an automotive compound. It really takes the yellow out of the keys and still leaves them nice and shiny despite all that sanding. While that's being done, it's time to address this rusty harp bass. You can see it's definitely seen some wear along with a lot of this keyboard. So first, we need to take off the mounting screws for the harp, then undo the ground wire from the damper rail. Now we have a free-moving harp. With that done, we now have the fun of removing these seized rusty screws. All 10 of them. Most of them were pretty easy, but some of them were pretty rusty. Maybe this comes from my framing days, but I'm always biased towards hand tools rather than power tools for disassembly like this, just so there's just less stripping and hurt to any sort of materials that may be already damaged. With the front screws out, we can now lift up the tone bar section of the harp and remove it from the metal frame. Now with the pickup section removed, our rusty harp frame is ready for cleaning. Before I go though, I want to take apart this side action block as it was pretty dirty and slightly moldy from the last rat inhabitants that lived in it while it was in a garage. I don't want to hand this off to the next player, so we're going to get rid of that. I decided to take these parts home and do this section in my garage as I don't want any of these particulates in my shop's air. You can see a fun close-up of that fun gunk, and luckily these are two rectangular pieces which will do just fine with my random orbital sander. It's important when you're working with this real gross stuff to get a nice respirator so you don't die early. And also gloves, because, well, do I have to explain it? As for sanding grit, we want material removed fast, so I'm using an 80 grit 5-inch pad. Now, after a little bit on the orbital sander, you can see it's a lot cleaner and a lot less grody from all of that gunk. Here I'm also doing the side cheek block mount, which I would end up not needing, but it was still pretty gross and thought I should do it while I had everything out. With that out of the way, it was time to get our handy fold-out table and address the harp issue. You can see there's a lot of corrosion, a lot of pitting, and just a lot of grossness. So we're going to go ahead with that random orbital sander, 80 grit, and sand it just like we would with wood. Now maybe there's some fancy metal sanding discs that I don't know about, but this did a pretty damn good job with it being not that. So I would recommend doing it this way, though I'm sure someone will rat me out in the comments. Please note, this is a gross job and you will have metal shavings everywhere, including your lungs if you don't follow that respirator. So be cautious of where you're doing it, especially if you're indoors. And while I do frame these videos as guides, it's important that you do your own research as this is only my way of doing it, and I'm sure there are better, safer, and easier options from what you've seen in these videos that I post. This isn't some all-knowing guide to electric piano repair. With one side done, I was seriously impressed with the progress we were making on only a pad down. It looks so much better and so much smoother, and I'm really surprised with how much pitting came out. I picked up this Black & Decker mouse corner sander, which honestly did a terrible job, but it did eventually get those corners cleaned up and looking just as good as the outside. With our harp frame mostly done, it was now time to prime. Roast me in the comments, but I'm pretty proud of this DIY spraying setup. Not the best for any dust, but pretty alright. Here I am using a Rust-Oleum Rust Heavy Specific primer. It is, I believe, automotive based, so it's meant to protect and go over any extra rusty spots and stop them from spreading, as far as I believe at least. And I'm hoping that since I got rid of most of the rust, that it should have a pro job at doing it. I'm still wanting to switch over to the Catalyst-esque spray cans, but I'm just not there yet. With 3 coats of primer, it was time to let it sit for a little bit and then start on our Rust-Oleum grind, again going for that Ace Classic with the gold metallic spray. This gold metallic was pretty freaking close to the original. A little maybe too gold for my taste, but coming right out of the factory, I don't doubt they looked pretty close to what this spray can got with us. We did another 3 coats with the metallic spray, and it just looks so good. I can't wait to bang it up when I'm putting everything back together. Now it was time to take our pickup bar out of retirement and get it back on our harp. And you can't forget the tone bar section. Before we put it all together though, I want to address the pickup metal mounting points, as they're a little grody and I think they could be shined up a little better. Going at them with Flitz metal polish and a whole lot of Q-tips, they eventually became a lot shinier than they were before, though I probably could have removed the pickup screw and made it a lot easier. While we're here, let's remove this super rusty RCA out and get it cleaned up a little bit with the wire wheel on the Dremel. Soldering our pickup wire back on the RCA, we can now see it's much cleaner and less rusty. And while we've got that wire wheel out, let's go ahead and clean up any surface rust on our tone bar section. With our harp clean and dry, we can now put our pickup section and our tone bar section back on our new harp along with the same screws that it came with. I did swap a few if they were a little too rusty, but most of them were pretty clean, just a little bit dirty. Now looking a million times better without all of that cruddy rust on it. So I've been going back and forth on whether or not I should replace the tone bars because some of them are definitely a little more beat up than others, but there's no rust on them. And while the treble end is a little rough, it's just cosmetic, and I feel like replacing them with regalvanized tone bars or regalvanizing this set might just be more hassle than what it's cosmetically worth. So with the cosmetics done on the harp, we can go ahead and put it back in the system and then get everything regulated action-wise. But before we go put it back in the action, we have to clean up that gross back section. This was the little rat home that once was, and they sure did have a lot of poop they left behind. Hantavirus is a thing, so again, please mask up when you're doing this. I will note this whole section has been previously Lysoled, at least in the wood sections, because I did go through it beforehand before I put it in my house, so this was previously disinfected a little bit. We can now put on our fresh and clean harp mounting block and screw it back into our action. Speaking of the cheek blocks, it was time to take it to my local wood refinisher to see what he could do about maybe making me a walnut-esque block. While he was sorting that out, it was time to start on our action. First, with these wobbly balance rail pins. With them wobbling like this, there's no way I'm going to be able to reliably square the key without it bending. So I'm going to pull it out and put a little bit of white glue and water mixture in the hole so it hopefully swells it up a little bit to give us a nice tight grip on that metal pin. I got this idea from my mentor in acoustic pianos, as this is the same thing as we both have balance rail pins in our instruments. She recommends an Elmer's glue, but I didn't have it on hand, so I substituted it with the Quick and Thick wood glue. Applying the mixture as deep in the hole as we could, and then letting it sit and swell for a little bit. Putting that new pin in, it was good as new, and honestly, I was pretty surprised it worked this well. With our pin nice and tight, we can now move on to some other miscellaneous issues, like some of the buffing residue that came off while polishing. It's this white car buffing solution, and it's just an easy wet rag to get it nice and clean. We also have a bit of a sticking key issue, as when one is pressed, the other rubs up against it. And you can clearly see the end is pretty warped towards the other pedestal. So I'm heating up the skinniest portion of our key stem and giving it a little bit of a bend back where it should. Be careful not to split your key stem, because that's no fun. Now it is much more even, and putting it back in the keyboard, you'll see they don't rub. So here we have the Rhodes action taken out, and I want to preface this by saying that this keyboard was already worked on by me for my own personal needs. I did the bump mod, I did all of the key leveling, dip, all that stuff. But I want to go over it again since that was a year or two ago, and I've learned a lot more, and I just want to double check before sending it to someone else that the work is good and it doesn't need to be redone. So a Fender Rhodes should have about 3/8 key dip from that 2-inch marker down to the 3/8 tape marker, or about 10 millimeters. On both sides, we are getting good key dip, which means it's time to go ahead and level, which my last job was so-so on. Here I am squaring these keys as they are just a little bit slanted due to wear. A little pat on the balance rail pin with some protective rubber will make it nice and straight and stop bending. Squaring is honestly a pretty tedious process, up there with leveling, as you just got to get down and dirty and at eye level with the keys, which really messes up my neck. Taking off our front rail felt, we can now apply the little brass washer that will keep the key from going too far down when putting our leveling stick up. You want to make sure both of your end keys are at the same height, because they wouldn't be level then and you'd be leveling on a slant. Now that we have the leveling stick up, we can fill the gaps in the keys with paper punchings to then put underneath the balance rail to level out the key bed. Applying the punchings is a simple but tedious job that just includes lifting up the key, taking off the felt washer, and then putting back down that new punching and then reapplying the felt bushing. With a few passes later, our keys are nice and level, and we can now move on to adjusting our harp. The first thing you want to do when setting your harp is setting escapement, or where the hammer sits after being fully pressed. You want to have enough of a gap between the tine and your hammer, or else you're going to choke out that tine and cut it from ringing. Putting our new harp back on its supports, we can see that the current key escapement is quite large. We are looking at almost 15 millimeters in distance, which the max should be about 9 for this section. This means we'll have to take off this shim here that is really glued down and then get to sanding that side harp block. Before we sand though, we want to check to make sure that shim wasn't just doing the job, and it wasn't. We're still at about 14 millimeters. You can also see on our treble side, it is pretty far when it should be about a millimeter or 2 away. Right now, it's sitting at probably 8 or 9. So off goes that shim too. And with the shims not being the problem, we now have to take apart the harp supports again so we could sand them smooth and a little bit lower for our harp. First, I thought the plane sander might try getting a good amount of material off the supports, but it didn't. So it was time to buy a belt sander. I guess while I was there, I should have bought a support too. So I lightly clamped down the other harp support and used it as a backstop. Now it was time to take away material until we were at the right escapement level, and not get that material on my shirt. Checking our escapement, we can see we made a pretty big improvement, being at just over 10 millimeters. On the treble end, we are much closer, but still need a little more to go. So it was back to the belt sander for some more material. And of course, I took off too much material, so it was time to make some new 1/32 of an inch shims. These polycarbonate sheets actually worked pretty good, though I'd probably just venture for the traditional wood ones next time. I just don't have a cutting plane that tight in its tolerances. It's important to test the instrument plugged in when testing your escapement, because too much escapement will definitely make you lose some tones, while keeping it too close, you will hear that blocking, which you hear here. You can especially hear the blocking here, where the hammer tips are pressing against those tines and choking them. So we need to add a shim on the appropriate side to see if that remedies it. I ended up adding a few shims on our base end, probably because I cut a little too much off that harp mounting block, but it sounded so much better with a little extra breathing room. Now with it sounding good, we need to adjust the strike line, which is where the hammer tips hit the tines in its whole length. This is done by moving the harp forward and backward on each side to get that correct tone. Once your strike line is set, tape the harp down and start drilling those holes. With the holes drilled, we can take off our harp and start removing our damper sustain rail. This is what pushes down our dampers when we use our sustain pedal. The problem I'm having here is that some dampers are not lowering at the same time as others. So I'm pushing that part of the metal up so it's in line with the others, so when that rail comes back down on it, they're all moving down at the same time. You can see some of those offenders here. Slowly making changes, taking the rail back off, and then changing those small, minute metal bends to get them nice and even. I absolutely love this little paint spatula, or whatever you'd call it, as it's nice and thin to get under the metal damper wire, yet it's curved so that you don't have to bump any of the adjacent ones. With them looking pretty good, let's go ahead and put the damper rail back in its mounting place and give it a final check. Here I am lubing up those pivot points and screwing them down into the rail. As you can see, they are much more even when going down than they were before. And a sidetrack, my Tolex guy just told me that it was time to go pick up, so I grabbed the new case and it looks so good. This is my first time outsourcing Tolex, and I think he did a wonderful job. I really love that cream color we picked. It's reminiscent of that blonde Fender amp early 60s era, and I think it's going to go great with the lid color we picked. Speaking of the lid, just like Christmas morning, we had all at the same time, and we decided to go with this jet black sparkle finish. They did an amazing job with this, and it is super glossy and also super staticky, but even better, they put it on the pedal. So before that gets scratched, we're going to put that away so we can get to the rest of the work. Once our leg mounting screws are on, we are all good in our case section, and it's time to get using it. Thankfully, the case is quite light when there's nothing in it. What we're doing here is poking holes through the bottom Tolex to get those bottom action mounting screws in place. And here it is with all of the screws prepped and ready for the action. But before we do that, we need to install the electronics. This time around, I'm going with a Retroflyer preamp. This is a third-party preamp that includes the suitcase vibrato, along with a little extra oomph with that 120 volt wall voltage. This is my first time using a third-party preamp too. So the original plan was to put an IEC socket in the back of the case and then have you plug it straight into there. But this kit came with a power brick which had that socket, so I had to find a way to connect the socket from the case to that power brick and put the brick inside the case. So it was off to Ace to get some more crimp connectors, some cable, and some Dippin' Dots. I ended up buying 2 feet of this tri-cord wire, and what this is going to do is bridge that gap between the brick and the case-mounted port with those crimp connectors. So just like that last video with the Molex, I'm going to solder these on just because I find them a bit more reliable, and I haven't bought the crimper yet. Here they are, nice and clean on one side, and we're ready to plug it into our IEC. It was a surprisingly tight fit, which is always great, and in the end, looks pretty all right. So here was the test fit in the back of the case. The original plan for this was to have this extra port so that the player did not need to wire a cable through the case. This also lets you remove the cable if it needed to be replaced. When done though, we did have a bit of a wiggle, so it was time to break out the extreme super weld and get it glued up. With it super welded in place, we can now wait a little bit and come back, and hopefully it shouldn't move. After a bit of a shimmy, we got the action back in the case, and I ran into a problem. So I ran into a bit of an issue with placing this big ass brick. I think I might be able to try it just under that sustain riser there, but if not, this is gonna change things. So I was able to fit it into that crevice right there. It does move though, which I'm not too fond of, but hopefully once that cable's in, it should be pretty tied down. Now that I know what that would look like, we can now dictate the length of our wire, and I can start making those other crimp connections. Now it's finally time we get to open our new name rail and set up the front end of our preamp. The faceplate I picked covers all of the holes that were pre-drilled from the Vintage Vibe reproduction name rail. Once lined up, we can go ahead and remove that backing adhesive and slowly stick it on, making sure that it's nice and straight. With our faceplate on, we can now stick those potentiometers through the holes and tighten them down, along with the new knobs. With the action back in, we can now go back to our damper situation and fix some of the keys that are ringing out in our high treble. This was caused by the change in our strike line, as the dampers are now hitting the pickups and not the tines where they should. So off goes the harp again, and we can start counting to see where exactly that problematic damper was. Getting to it, we can now slowly bend them up just a little bit and then reapply our harp and see if that changed anything. And what do you know? It didn't. So off goes the harp again, and this time we try a different route. I figured shaving down the bit of that felt on the pickup side would allow it a little extra clearance to move past that pickup and actually mute the tine. So I trimmed maybe a millimeter or two off the back of it, and it actually worked. So it was time to repeat this process with some of the more stubborn offenders, especially up in that last octave or so. I will say I did not record probably half of this process. I hate dampers on Rhodes, and this is kind of the reason, but it's also the reason I need to get it right and right good. So this time is going to be well spent in the end. And this couldn't be an Emma repairs project without me starting to second guess myself. And of course, I think maybe my escapement isn't right, and maybe I'm doing it wrong. So I try and take off some shims to see if that helps my tone and play around with the height a little bit. And I actually found that I needed a small adjustment to bring a little less room to my hammer movement. So I took a shim off the bass end and ran into this. So I was doing a little work with the strike line and the escapement, changing up our shim placement and how many shims should be where. And after doing so, I found that it wasn't sounding very good. And I was pretty concerned because I've been in the Wurlitzer mindset. I've been doing so many Wurlitzers and not enough Rhodes, and I completely forgot when you change your escapement, you gotta change your strike line. And my strike line was messed up. It sounded terrible, but I moved it half an inch back on the bass. Perfect. So we're gonna go ahead and re-drill those holes. And ironically enough, the holes where we need to go are the exact holes that were there in the beginning. So shout out to the early 70s setup tech team, because they knew what they were doing, unlike me. So now, with 10 minutes of confusion and frustration aside, we can now start with setting our volume. Here I'm giving you a little cross-section of what exactly I'm doing when changing the volume. It's pretty much just pushing that pickup forward and backwards so it's closer or farther away from the vibrating tine. So I repeat this process with all 73 keys, matching them to the adjacent one and then later that one in the middle so they have a nice overall even volume. Here is me trying my best to get an unbiased representation of the volume thanks to my giant Ampeg Gemini 2. With all that aside, this is finally starting to sound a little more like your normal Fender Rhodes. At least one that hasn't been serviced and sounds like shit. Here you can see exactly what voicing does and how it sounds. You can see that such a small difference can make quite a big tonal change, And this is when the fun part of voicing comes in. Now it's time for us to slowly go along and adjust each tine's position in accordance to their pickup and make sure that they're all even tone-wise across the board. I was also having some issues with the lower bass tines oscillating right to left instead of just up and down. So we're going to go ahead and reinforce those with some tighter tone bar screws. This should hopefully bring that back end a little closer to the harp and stop it from moving side to side. Now, one thing I've struggled with is this one lousy note. And what's even more concerning is that is a replaced reed. It's always been really bad like that, too. Giving it a little more of a hand tighten resolved that issue and made it ring out like the others. Guess it wasn't tight enough. While we're here, I'm also going to straighten out some other tines that weren't aligned with their tone bar. This is your PSA to be very careful with your socket wrench when using it on delicate parts like these. And now are much straighter and ready to be picked up by those pickups. You can see another offending tone bar here. This time, I believe it was a case of it being bent. You could see that bend, so I'm going to slightly bend it back and hopefully get it as straight as I can. Unfortunately, the tine is still quite off-center. Now we can see a correctly placed tine. I did take off the harp brackets that are normally here. They tend to choke out the neighboring tines, so we're going to fill in those screw holes with a bit of wood glue and then hammer in some wooden dowels to seal them up. Here I am practicing for my caveman cosplay. I think I'm doing all right. Once dry, we can go ahead and use our Japanese flush saw to chop them off and get them nice and close to the surface. Unfortunately, since we changed our escapement height with those shims, we now don't have our holes lining up for our little pivot bar. Don't mind the struggle. It's pretty heavy. You can see here that I need to put my new hole right around where that old one is. So we're going back to Caveman and making some new plugs. So with our harp on, we can now drill that new pivot arm hole, and it was right over the old one, which I thought was kind of funny. So you might have noticed that the clip where I was drilling out the new hole for the pivot arm, there was no shims. And I thought, well, I'll just add them later. Well, going into screw, I realized the reason I re-drilled was because I added those shims. It barely fits the holes now. So time to unscrew and refill once again. So out goes the screw again, and in goes more wood glue and another dowel. Woohoo! I also bought some replacement pivot arm hardware, and you could see the washers that counteract that gap in the harp when changing the strike line. I finally got the call from my wood guy that my new cheek blocks were done, as the ones he gave right here, I didn't much like the grain. So, going to pick it up, The new ones are much better, and I love the grain pattern on them, and I think they just fit in a lot nicer. These ones, however, were solid, so we had to take out the original hollow cheek block mount, which would go under the hollow cheek block, but this time we are drilling straight through our solid ones. I used the already placed guide hole to put a little skewer through and line up the cheek block so it's nice and parallel with the key, and then mark our new holes with a marker and then drilling them in on the bench. I honestly think my next tool purchase is a step drill bit because I do this step up stuff with like 5 different bits way too much. With some non-rusty new screws, we can now put in our cheek block and it's nice and solid. Now that our key level is finalized and we're not going to be moving them anymore, we need to go ahead and polish them up and then lubricate them. We're using a Flitz metal polish with this fancy new specialty tool that I got at the piano technician convention. And honestly, I kind of just like the rag better. Haley also agreed it was a little finicky, and I think we're just used to using the rag and having the feel of our fingertips. This is the dry film lubricant I use on the key pins when we're done polishing, and this is a dry film that goes over the pin, which will then let it move much smoother with that felt bushing for years to come. While I have the harp off again, I'm going to go ahead and fill the old harp holes that would mount the harp onto the action. Honestly, this dowel filling process is super satisfying.
I only have one hole.
With the proper hole now drilled, we can use our pivot arms to get to tuning. Tuning a Rhodes is pretty simple, and you could see on my VeraTuner Professional app here that our C note is about 2 cents sharp. So I'm moving that spring on the tine just so slightly down so it's going a little bit flatter and we're right even at that 0 cent mark or within 0.5. In this process, I'm flicking the tine a little bit with the harp up so I can easily use my fingers to move that spring ever so slightly. There is a slight tuning change depending on the velocity you strike the tine, which can be a little confusing when tuning. Our tuning is much better now, though it definitely needs some tweaking as the velocities with the key and the hammer do change it ever so slightly. And this is the part of the tuning where my back really starts to break as I need to lean forward over the harp and adjust the tuning while pressing the keys instead of having the harp up and doing it with my fingers. I use the little forked tuning tool right here, but in the end, I do end up switching to that needle nose plier as sometimes the spring on the tine can get really stiff and you need to squeeze it to give it some room to breathe. Like I said previously, the velocity that your hammers hit the tine does affect the slight tuning of that note. So it's important to find a good in-between in terms of how hard you press the key, because especially on the bass end, things can really start to fluctuate as you get harder and harder on those keys. In the last octave or so, you can tend to find some notes that start to die off a little early, and that's when these tone bar clips really come in handy. It adds a little extra mass to the end of your tone bar, and depending on the positioning, can really change how long the note rings out compared to what it did previously. I figured it was finally time to glue down our shims, so here comes out the extreme super weld again, and they are going nowhere. Getting ready for our final install, we're going to screw on our legs. and then get our crossbars in. Here I am hooking up our power brick to our IEC port. The connectors were nice and tight, but not crazy tight, just, enough. And here I am trying to figure out how exactly to mount this brick so it's not dangling around inside there. I decided to go with a Velcro option. I'm sticking 2 of them onto the brick, and then I'm going to stick the other 2 into the bottom of the back action. Dad and I are going to try our best to get the action in, and of course, there's always some hiccups. But we do get it in, obviously. And we can go ahead and start putting in those action screws. Here you can see our IEC cables nice and underneath the back of the action, and here we can tie up any of the excess of the barrel plug and route it to the front name rail. In goes the RCA jack and our IEC plug. 1/4 inch goes to the front name rail, and we can finally test it.
That sounds good.
But just before I started to record my demos, plugging into my Zoom recorder, I found this deafening hiss coming from my earphones. So I did some more digging and contacted Avian Studios, and he let me know that I should probably go ahead and ground my damper arms. Now in these early models, the damper arms are all individual, so each damper is not connected. But in later models, they're all connected by a little piece of wire in a comb fashion. This lets them all be grounded really easily if you just ground one. Unfortunately, that's not my case, so I have to go ahead and take it apart and ground all of them. Now you may be thinking, why? Well, we're running a 120 volt AC voltage right next to our pickup and our whole keyboard action. So with all this juice flowing right next to, within inches of it, there's gonna be some stray voltages that start to be picked up and amplified by these giant pieces of metal, kind of like an antenna. By grounding these pieces, we can remove that voltage safely and in a designated spot so it doesn't get picked up by anything that's going through our audio. Now that we're in the home stretch, let's go ahead and add that 73 logo to the front of our lid. And like all good things I do, there's a problem. Somehow, our plastic lid is no longer fitting on our action. Come to find, the new finish that they put on ended up making it pretty thick, and I had to take off a little bit of this bottom corner to alleviate some of that issue. I made sure to keep far under any of the visible lid that you can see when in the case, and I took off probably 1/8 of an inch or so, and it worked. And just to show you really can't see anything. The logo stamp is so nerve-wracking, I really need to find a better solution. Now in my last Wordleter video, I had a comment from someone talking about the lid speakers and using a Dynamat inner surface material to dampen those frequencies. I ended up looking into Dynamat and found a different company called Resonix. The test results did not lie, though the price definitely reflects that. Anywho, I decided why not? The cost of this is not getting put on this keyboard because I'm getting a lot of it, and if it doesn't work, I don't know, I'll sell it or something. So with our acoustic insulating foam in, I can now cut it to size and temporarily tape it to the top of our lid. I specifically picked this option because it's skinny, so it won't affect the tone bars, but unfortunately, it didn't really affect anything. And honestly, I didn't have too high hopes for this. I mean, people say, the sound of the action is why I buy the Rhodes, but I just find it annoying. And this one isn't crazy loud, but for me, it's definitely louder than some. So, since I bought it, to hell with it, I'll just put it on. I mean, it doesn't hinder anything. And I think it made a little bit of a difference, maybe. And finally, we can get to our before and after. Apologies for the crappy before photos. I didn't think this was going to be a video. So I hope you guys enjoyed this whole process. I do like doing these videos where I run through the whole restoration with you. And if you like this, I have much more on my channel. And if you like this specific keyboard, you can actually buy it. At least at the time of recording, it is for sale, unlike most of my other ones, which are for previously purchased for clients. This one can be bought by you to put it in your cozy little home. If you do want to buy this, there will be a link in the pinned comment to find it online and either ship it or buy it locally.